Why was she serving lunch when she'd once led men into fire? The question echoed in her mind as the clatter of silverware filled the grand hall of Fort Liberty. Light spilled through tall windows, glinting off metals and polished brass, but all she could see was the tray trembling slightly in her hands. Her uniform was pressed, her posture perfect, yet there was something off about the whole scene. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. Sergeant Major Clare Donovan had fought through dust storms, roadside bombs, and the slow-burn terror of waiting for dawn in hostile territory. But humiliation, that was new territory, and it cut deeper than any bullet ever had. Colonel Reeves had made sure of that. "Let's keep her busy with something she can't mess up," he'd said earlier that morning, his voice thick with condescension as he tossed an apron her way. It landed on her desk like a sentence. She had stared at it for a moment, at the thin white fabric resting against her calloused hands, and felt something inside her twist. She'd seen soldiers break in a dozen different ways, but this was the quiet kind. The kind no one salutes. Now, hours later, she stood beside the long table lined with generals, men whose names were printed on reports she'd risked her life to make possible. Their laughter rolled like distant artillery, easy and carefree. Conversations drifted about operations, promotions, and politics. No one noticed the woman at the end of the table, moving silently between them like a ghost. Except one man did. General Marcus Ellison, tall, gray-haired, with a presence that seemed to steady the air itself. But his gaze wasn't on her face. It was lower, at something that gleamed faintly against her chest. A single silver star pinned above her heart. The silver star. She hadn't wanted to wear it that day, but it was regulation, and regulations were the only things she had left. The metal caught the sunlight, sending a small spark across the polished table. Ellison's eyes narrowed. Before he spoke, Claire's mind had already drifted back to the sand, the noise, the chaos of Helmand province. The smell of burnt fuel and iron. The screams. Don't think about that now, she told herself. Not here. But memory doesn't ask permission. That morning, when Reeves reassigned her, she had saluted without a word. That was her mistake. Silence had always been her weapon, precise, cold, and dangerous when used right. But silence could also be mistaken for submission, and Reeves was the kind of man who needed to feel taller than everyone in the room. He'd been in command for barely 3 weeks, already making waves with his modern leadership approach, which mostly meant shifting paperwork and taking credit for other people's grit. He didn't know her story, didn't care to. To him, she was another name transferred into his command after a long rotation overseas. A woman past her prime, someone to sideline politely. He couldn't have been more wrong. When she entered the hall that afternoon, balancing the tray, she caught her reflection in the glass of a framed portrait, a younger officer, bright-eyed and proud, looking out from behind the years. For a moment, Claire didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her jaw was harder now, her eyes deeper. They carried the weight of people who had seen too much and survived anyway. She moved between the tables like she was navigating a minefield, precise steps, careful balance, never drawing attention. But even as she poured water and set plates, her instincts betrayed her. Eyes scanning exits, corners, faces. Always aware, always alert. The soldier never left the room. From across the hall, she could feel Reeves watching her, leaning back in his chair, smirking slightly, as if her presence validated something inside him. Power, maybe. Control. He had told her earlier, "You've done your share of field work, Sergeant Major. Time to show some hospitality." She had wanted to respond, to remind him that field work was what kept his flag flying in the first place, but she swallowed the words. Not because she was afraid, because she'd learned that some battles weren't worth fighting with words. The moment came quietly. Ellison reached for his drink, paused, and then his voice cut through the laughter like a blade. "Sergeant Major Donovan." The room froze. Chairs stilled, forks stopped midair, Even Reeves blinked, caught off guard. Claire felt the tray tilt in her grip, steadied it, and answered softly, "Yes, sir." Ellison's eyes locked on her. "At ease, Sergeant Major." A murmur rolled through the table. The rank hadn't been used all day. Reeves had introduced her as logistics aide for the luncheon. But Ellison knew, he remembered. "What the hell are you doing serving lunch?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Reeves straightened, voice cracking. "Just standard protocol, sir, I thought." Ellison's glare stopped him cold. "Protocol?" His tone was sharp, incredulous. "You made a Silver Star recipient serve hors d'oeuvres." The silence after that was heavy enough to crush a man. Every general turned toward Clare, some curious, others embarrassed. Reeves' face drained of color. Ellison stepped closer, his voice softening but his authority unmoved. "Afghanistan, wasn't it? Operation Iron Dagger." Claire swallowed, the name pulling at something deep inside her. "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly. "I read that report." And just like that, the walls of the hall faded. She was back there again, the desert night, the ambush, the fire. The sound of gunfire so close it felt like rain against metal. The cries over the radio, "We're hit, we're hit, Lieutenant down." She had been the last one standing, holding the perimeter with a cracked rifle and a radio that barely worked. 6 hours of hell before reinforcements arrived. She carried her wounded lieutenant nearly 200 yards through open ground. But none of that mattered to Reeves. To him, she was a reminder that no matter how high he rose, there were still soldiers whose shadows reached farther than his rank. Ellison turned to the room. "Do any of you know what that medal represents, what she did to earn it?" No one answered. Claire wanted to disappear. She didn't wear it for this, for attention or recognition. She wore it for the ones who couldn't anymore. She found her voice. "Sir, with respect, it was a team effort." Ellison's eyes softened, but he didn't look away. "And yet you were the one still fighting when the team was gone." A pause, the kind that says more than any speech could. Reeves shifted uncomfortably, his hand twitching toward his collar. "Sir, if I may." "You may not," Ellison cut him off, his tone turning to steel. "You've got one of the bravest NCOs in this division, and you've got her carrying plates." The general's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every word hit like an order. "Effective immediately," Ellison said, turning to Clare. "You belong at this table, Sergeant Major, not waiting on it." Clare froze. "Sir, with respect." "That's an order." He pulled out a chair for her. The world seemed to still. She could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the faint scrape of a chair leg somewhere down the table, the quick inhale of someone trying to process what just happened. She sat, apron still tied around her waist, Silver Star catching the light, surrounded by men who'd never once looked at her before. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Reeves looked like a man watching his own authority unravel, thread by thread. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Ellison leaned back, eyes on her. "Tell them, Sergeant Major, tell them what really happened in Helmand." And for a moment, Claire couldn't breathe. Years of silence pressed against her chest, the memories she'd buried under duty and discipline clawing their way up. She wanted to refuse, to stay quiet. But then she looked around the table at the polished medals, the empty smiles, the distance between decisions and consequences, and something inside her shifted. She set down the tray. Her voice was low, steady. "We were pinned down outside Sangin District, 30 insurgents, 3 vehicles disabled, no comms, we held until sunrise." She didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. She just told the truth, the raw, heavy kind that left no room for applause. When she finished, no one spoke. Ellison nodded slowly, pride glinting in his eyes. "That's the kind of soldier we need leading the next generation." The words struck harder than she expected. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen not for the medal, but for what it meant. As the lunch continued, Conversation picked up in fragments, quieter now, thoughtful. Reeves stayed silent. Claire sat in that strange stillness, half uniform, half apron, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle around her. The humiliation had burned away, replaced by something steadier. Respect. Not demanded, not asked for, earned again. And though she said nothing more, her silence this time wasn't surrender. It was victory. Because sometimes dignity doesn't need to speak. It simply stands. Why was it so hard to breathe in a room full of applause? They didn't clap, not really. But the silence that followed her story was heavy with something close to reverence, a kind of wordless acknowledgement. Still, as Claire sat there, surrounded by the smell of roasted meat and polished brass, her chest felt tight. Too tight. She could feel eyes on her, admiration, maybe even guilt, and yet none of it settled right. Because in her mind, she wasn't sitting in a grand hall anymore. She was back there. Helmand Province. The dust. The blood. The static-laced voices on the radio that never answered back. General Ellison's voice brought her back to the present. "Sergeant Major Donovan," he said softly, "I imagine that wasn't easy to share." She managed a faint smile. "No, sir, but some things shouldn't stay buried forever." He nodded, eyes kind. "That's courage too, the quiet kind." She gave a short nod in return, but her gaze drifted past him to Colonel Reeves, sitting rigid at the far end of the table, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He avoided her eyes. The man who had reduced her to a servant hours ago now couldn't even look at her. It should have felt like justice. It didn't. Instead, it felt hollow. When the luncheon finally ended, the generals began to stand, exchanging polite nods and murmured farewells. Chairs scraped softly against marble floors. Somewhere near the door, the faint laughter of aides filtered in. The ceremony of rank and respect resumed its familiar rhythm. Claire stood too, the apron still tied at her waist, an accidental symbol now, half uniform, half humility. As she turned to leave, Ellison stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. "Donovan," he said quietly, "walk with me." They stepped out into the corridor. The echoes of the luncheon faded behind them. The hallway smelled faintly of old paper and floor wax, the sterile scent of bureaucracy. Ellison's tone softened. "You've carried yourself with more grace than most officers ever could." She didn't respond right away. Her mind was still spinning, half anchored in the now, half lost in memory. Finally she said, "With respect, sir, grace doesn't win firefights." "No," Ellison replied, "but it wins the moments after." He stopped, turning to face her. "You didn't belong behind a tray today, Sergeant Major. You belong in command. I've seen 100 officers chase rank, but very few carry dignity the way you do." His words landed softly but with weight. She didn't know what to say. "Thank you, sir." Ellison nodded. "Reeves will be informed of his realignment. You'll oversee the advanced leadership program from now on. I trust that won't be an issue." Claire's lips twitched faintly. "No, sir, not at all." As he walked away, she stood alone in the corridor for a moment, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights humming overhead. She exhaled slowly, the kind of long breath you take after holding it for too long. But relief didn't come, only quiet. When she returned to the hall, Reeves was waiting. He was leaning against the doorway, his uniform immaculate, expression unreadable. The same man who'd handed her an apron that morning now stood in her way. "Sergeant Major," he said stiffly. "Colonel." An awkward pause stretched between them, the kind that reveals more than it hides. "I didn't mean any disrespect," he muttered. Claire's eyes met his, calm, sharp, tired. "You didn't have to mean it, sir, you just didn't see me." Reeves flinched, the words hitting harder than he expected. She stepped past him, but he spoke again, lower this time. "You think you're the only one who's seen hell out there." She stopped, turned slightly. No, sir, I just think some of us learn to remember it differently. She didn't wait for his reply. Her boots echoed down the hallway, slow, deliberate, controlled. She walked like a soldier again, not because someone ordered her to, but because it was who she was. That night the barracks were quiet, too quiet. Claire sat alone in her small quarters, the dim light casting long shadows across the walls. Her silver star rested on the desk, the same one she'd worn earlier, still catching glints of moonlight. She'd taken it off hours ago, but it still felt like it was pressing against her chest. She poured herself a cup of coffee gone cold and stared at it. Outside the base slept. Inside her thoughts refused to. The past had a strange way of visiting, not like a memory, but like an old comrade showing up at your door, uninvited, bringing ghosts with him. Her mind drifted again to the heat, the screaming, the chaos. The ambush. Her squad had been convoying through a narrow stretch near Sangan, dust thick as fog, visibility down to meters. A routine supply run, the kind that never stayed routine for long. The explosion came from the left, a flash, a roar, then darkness. When she came to, her ears were ringing. The radio was gone. The lieutenant was bleeding out. Half the convoy was on fire. She remembered crawling through broken glass, dragging her wounded behind a shattered MRAP. Her hands had bled so much she couldn't tell where her skin ended and the dirt began. She remembered the insurgents advancing, silhouettes in the dust, moving closer, shouting in Pashto. She had one rifle, 3 mags, and a radio that cut out every 5 seconds. And she remembered one thing clearer than anything else, the moment she realized no one was coming. Reinforcements were hours away. She made the decision then to hold, not out of glory or orders, just instinct. Because someone had to. 6 hours later, the reinforcements found her half-conscious, still firing, her arm bandaged with her own torn sleeve, her voice hoarse from shouting coordinates no one heard. They said it was heroic. She remembered it as survival. A knock on the door pulled her back. She straightened, "Come in." It was Reeves. He hesitated in the doorway like a man entering a confessional. "You got a minute?" Claire set down her cup, gestured slightly. "If it's about the luncheon, sir." "It's not," he interrupted. His voice was strained, quieter than before. "Well, it is, partly." He stepped inside, the air between them taut. "I read your file. I should have done that earlier." Claire raised an eyebrow. "You should have." "I didn't know what you'd been through." Her tone stayed even. "Most people don't ask." Reeves sighed, rubbing his temple. "You have to understand, command looks different from the top. You don't always see who's under the weight until they're gone." She studied him, not with anger but with something colder, clarity. "Then maybe you should start looking before they are." He met her gaze, something breaking behind his polished composure. "I underestimated you." "No, sir," she said softly. "You dismissed me, there's a difference." He swallowed. "You're right." A long silence followed, the kind that carries regret. Finally he said, "Ellison was right about one thing. You belong at that table, more than most of us ever will." She didn't respond, just nodded once, slow, deliberate. "Then don't forget what you saw today, Colonel, because next time it might be someone else you don't see coming." Reeves gave a faint, humorless smile. "Lesson learned." He turned to leave but paused at the door. "You'll do good leading that program, better than I ever could." When the door closed behind him, Claire exhaled, a breath that carried months of restraint. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peace. Later that night, she sat by the small window, watching the base lights flicker in the distance. A convoy moved slowly across the far road, taillights glowing red against the dark horizon. Her mind wandered to the names etched on the memorial wall back at Helmand. Her squad, her friends. She whispered softly into the still air. "You'd laugh if you saw me today, Bennett, apron and all." Her lips curled into a faint smile, the kind that hurts a little but heals something deeper. She leaned back in her chair, eyes closing, the soft hum of the air conditioning filling the silence. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. And in the quiet of that small room, with the silver star glinting faintly on her desk, Claire Donovan finally let herself rest. Because today, the world had remembered her. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to remember herself too. Why did command always feel lonelier the higher you went? The next morning, the sun rose sharp and cold over Fort Liberty. The base came alive with motion, the rhythmic thud of boots, the hum of engines, the clipped bark of orders. And amid that chaos, Sergeant Major Clare Donovan walked across the tarmac with a manila folder tucked under her arm and the faintest ache behind her eyes. The orders were clear. Effective immediately, she was to assume oversight of the Advanced Leadership Program, the elite course for officers and senior NCOs bound for command posts. On paper, it was an honor. In practice, it felt like stepping onto a minefield. Command was easy to write down, harder to live through. She reached the training wing just past 700 hours. The building looked the same as it had years ago, gray concrete, echoing halls, the faint smell of coffee and gun oil, but something about it felt heavier now. When she entered the classroom, a dozen faces turned toward her. Most were men, some young, some seasoned, all waiting. A few nodded politely, others didn't bother. She could feel the skepticism before anyone spoke, the quiet disbelief that a woman like her, decorated or not, belonged at the front of the room. She placed her folder on the desk, straightened her sleeves, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. "Good morning," she said finally. Her voice carried calm authority, steady as steel. "I'm Sergeant Major Donovan. I'll be overseeing your leadership evaluations for the next 8 weeks." A murmur rippled through the group. She could read their faces, curiosity, respect, defiance, all tangled together. One of them, a tall captain with a square jaw and an expression that said he thought he knew better, leaned back in his chair. "Ma'am, I thought Colonel Reeves was running the program." Claire met his gaze evenly. "He was, now he reports to me." The room went still. No further questions. She continued, "You're here because someone thinks you're fit to lead, but leadership isn't stripes or brass. It's decisions that don't let you sleep. It's the weight of other people's lives on your conscience. You'll learn that here or you'll wash out." Her words hung heavy in the air. A few of them shifted in their seats. The tall captain, though, just smirked faintly, the kind of smile that came from not knowing what you didn't know. Claire clocked it, filed it away. The same way she used to track insurgent movements through dusk clouds, quiet observation, no reaction. After the briefing, she retreated to her office, a small room overlooking the parade ground. Papers were stacked neatly on the desk. A single photo rested on the shelf behind her, a young lieutenant smiling awkwardly beside her unit in Helmand. The picture was sun-faded now, but the memory was. She traced the edge of the frame with her finger, her mind drifting. Bennett, Corporal Ortiz, Sergeant Vale, all gone. She stopped trying to remember the sound of their voices years ago. Memory played tricks that way. It dulled pain, but sharpened guilt. Her door opened without a knock. Reeves stepped inside. He looked different, tired, almost smaller somehow. His confidence had cracks now, visible around the edges. "Morning, Sergeant Major," he said. "Morning, sir," she replied, without looking up from her papers. He hesitated. "I just wanted to make sure you had everything you need for the program. Schedules, rosters." "I have it," she said simply. He nodded. "Good. Ellison's keeping an eye on the numbers, says this program. Under pressure after last quarter's dropouts." Claire finally looked up. "Pressure's part of the job." "Not this kind," he said quietly. "You'll be training officers who think they already know what leadership is. Some of them were my protégés. She leaned back slightly. Then maybe it's time they learn what it actually means. Reeves stared at her for a long moment. There was something in his eyes she couldn't quite name, regret maybe, or respect. "Good luck, Donovan," he said finally. "You'll need it." She gave a small nod. "I've had worse odds." He left without another word. The first week passed in a blur of drills, simulations, and assessments. Claire kept her approach simple, no theatrics, no lectures. She taught the way she'd learned, through pressure, through silence, through letting people reveal themselves when things went wrong. By the third day, the captain started cracking. She ordered a tactical decision exercise and ambush simulation, limited intel, no reinforcements. The task: get the wounded out and hold the line until extraction. They failed every time. When one lieutenant blamed his team for not following his plan, Claire stopped him cold. "Leadership isn't control," she said quietly. "It's accountability." The room fell silent. The young officer bristled. "With respect, ma'am, you weren't there. It's easy to judge from the sidelines." Claire's expression didn't change. "You're right, I wasn't there. I was in Helmand province. Operation Iron Dagger, 30 insurgents, 3 vehicles down, no backup." The color drained from his face. She stepped closer, voice calm but sharp. "And I still didn't blame my team. I buried them." No one spoke after that. The exercise ended early. That night she stayed late in the office, reviewing reports. Rain tapped softly against the window, the kind of slow, steady rhythm that pulled memories from where you buried them. She opened a drawer and pulled out a worn notebook, her field log from Afghanistan. The cover was stained, pages creased. She flipped through it slowly, tracing the ink-blurred handwriting, coordinates, call signs, casualty lists. Her hand paused on a line near the back. "If I make it home, promise I won't stop serving." She closed the notebook gently, exhaling. "You kept your promise," she whispered to herself, "just not the way you thought." The next morning, one of the trainees knocked on her door, the tall captain from earlier. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." She nodded, "Always." He hesitated. "I looked up Operation Iron Dagger last night. I didn't know you were that Donovan." She said nothing. He continued. "I was still in college when that happened. They made us read about it in a case study, The Stand at Sangin. You saved 7 people." Claire looked up slowly. "I was doing my job." He shook his head. "That wasn't a job, that was—" He stopped, choosing his words carefully. "That was something else." For the first time since she'd met him, his arrogance was gone. "I misjudged you," he admitted. "I'm sorry." Claire's gaze softened slightly. "Good. Now use that. Every time you think you've figured someone out, remember today." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." As he turned to leave, she added, "Captain." He paused. "Respect isn't about rank," she said quietly. "It's about responsibility, don't forget that." He gave a small nod and walked out. By the end of the second week, something had changed. The tone in the training halls shifted. Orders were sharper, discussions deeper. The group was learning not from fear but from reflection. Claire watched it happen with quiet pride, not the kind that swells, but the kind that steadies. Still, there were nights when the ghosts came back. In the stillness of her quarters, she sometimes saw their faces, Bennett smiling through dust, Ortiz lighting a cigarette against orders, Vale joking about ration coffee. They always appeared in silence, always gone before she could speak. One night she found herself whispering into the dark, "I'm still here. I don't know why, but I'm still here." The quiet didn't answer, but the ache eased a little. Friday afternoon, as the trainees prepared for the weekend, Claire walked across the parade ground. The air was cool, the horizon clear. She spotted General Ellison watching from the reviewing stand, hands clasped behind his back. "General," she greeted. "Sergeant Major," he replied with a faint smile. "How's the program?" "Rough," she said, "but they're learning." "That's good. Leadership should hurt a little. Means it's working." He studied her for a moment. "You look different." She raised an eyebrow. "Older." "Wiser," he said. "Maybe both." A small smile tugged at her lips. Ellison nodded toward the trainees. "They'll talk about you, you know, not because of the medal, because you made them confront themselves." Claire looked out over the field. "If that's all I leave behind, sir, it's enough." Ellison smiled faintly. "You've done more than enough." They stood there in silence for a while, watching the next generation march, boots hitting the ground in unison, the sound steady, strong, alive. And for the first time in years, Claire felt something she hadn't felt since the desert, peace with where she stood. Because she'd learned something the hard way. You don't have to be in battle to fight. Sometimes, the hardest war is remembering who you are after the gunfire stops. When did doing the right thing start feeling like a mistake? It had been 3 weeks since Sergeant Major Clare Donovan took over the Advanced Leadership Program. 3 weeks of early mornings, blunt evaluations, and long silences that made her trainees rethink every instinct they'd ever had about command. The program's numbers were improving, reports were solid, her people were sharper, hungrier, more honest. And yet, the more progress she made, the more enemies she seemed to earn. It started small, a memo here, a comment there, a phone call that ended too quickly. By the 4th week, she saw it clearly. Not everyone at Fort Liberty wanted her kind of leadership. Not the kind that stripped away rank and ego until all that was left was character. The kind that made men twice her size question what they were really fighting for. The morning she got the email, she was reviewing field performance data in her office. Rain pattered lightly outside. Her coffee had gone cold again. The subject line read, "Command concerns, leadership approach, SGT Maj Donovan." Her jaw tightened. She clicked it open. The message was clean, polite, and surgical. The kind of language bureaucrats used when they wanted to wound you without leaving fingerprints. "Concerns have been raised regarding your instructional style and interpersonal conduct. Several trainees have described your sessions as excessively critical, demoralizing, and emotionally taxing. Command requests clarification of your methodology and a proposed adjustment plan." No name signed, just command office. Claire leaned back in her chair, the glow of the monitor reflecting in her eyes. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she felt the slow burn of something deeper, disappointment. Because she knew this game, she'd seen it before. The system didn't punish failure, it punished discomfort. And truth always made someone uncomfortable. She closed the email, took a slow breath, and began typing her reply. Command. Respectfully, leadership is not comfort. My approach is not intended to demean but to prepare. Real battlefields don't come with safe words. My trainees are learning to lead under pressure, not to be liked. If that's a problem, I suggest we reevaluate what this program is meant to build. SGT Maj Clare Donovan. She sent it without hesitation. Later that day, as she walked across the base toward the training yard, she noticed the looks, some respectful, some uneasy, a few resentful. One of the trainees, Captain Voss, the tall one who'd once questioned her, approached her at the gate. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "they're saying command might audit the program. Is that true?" Claire gave a small nod. "Let them. If they want to see leadership, they'll find it here." Voss hesitated. "If they come for you, we'll back you up." That caught her off guard. She studied him for a moment. The arrogance that used to hang on his face was gone. What remained was resolve. She gave a faint, almost invisible smile. "That's good to hear, Captain. Hold that line." He nodded and went back to training. By evening, the sky had turned a bruised purple. The rain returned, heavier this time, steady, rhythmic, cleansing. Claire walked alone down the narrow hallway toward the mess hall. Most of the base was empty now, trainees gone, offices dark. She preferred it that way. The quiet gave her room to think and sometimes to breathe. As she passed the bulletin board by the entrance, she froze. There was a photo pinned under a stack of notices, a deployment memorial list from Operation Iron Dagger, her old unit. She'd seen it 100 times before, but tonight her eyes caught on one detail she'd never noticed. A name. Staff Sergeant Daniel Vale, presumed KIA. Her breath caught. Vale. Her squad sergeant, her friend, the one who'd taken the left flank when they were ambushed, the one whose radio went dead halfway through the firefight. She had believed for years he never made it out. Except now there was a note scribbled beside his name, faded pencil, barely legible. Repatriated, Bethesda Recovery Wing, 2013. Her pulse quickened. Bethesda. He'd lived. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the paper as rain drummed against the window. Then, without another thought, she turned and walked straight toward the comms office. The next day, she sat in a quiet hospital corridor 3 hours away from base. Bethesda Military Medical Center hadn't changed much: sterile walls, faint antiseptic smell, the low hum of distant monitors. The kind of place where time moved slower, like even the air carried the weight of memory. When the nurse finally pointed her toward the recovery ward, Claire hesitated outside the door. Her palms were sweating. That surprised her. She walked through fire and sand and death, but this was different. She took a breath, pushed the door open. The room was small, sunlit. A man sat by the window, his posture rigid, his hair streaked with gray. A scar ran from his temple down to his jaw. He looked up, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice rough from years of silence, he said, "You got older." Claire blinked. "So did you." He smiled faintly. "Guess neither of us died like we were supposed to." Her throat tightened. "I read your name on the wall, Vale, I thought." "I know," he interrupted gently. "Everyone did." She stepped closer. "Why didn't anyone tell me you made it back?" He looked out the window. "Because I didn't want to be found. Spent a year in recovery, then left the service. Figured the war had taken enough from me, didn't need to take what was left." Claire sat down beside him. "You could have said something." He shrugged. "You were still in. You had your own ghosts to carry." They sat in silence for a while, the rain outside whispering against the glass. Then Vale said quietly, "I heard what you did after the ambush. 6 hours alone. You saved us, Claire." She shook her head. "I didn't save anyone. I just refused to leave." "Same thing." She looked at him, then really looked. The scars, the tremor in his hands, the weariness behind his eyes. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something she'd buried deep. Grief, not for death, but for everything survival had cost. They talked for hours. About Helmand, about the others, about the lives that ended and the ones that didn't. Vale told her he'd found work training search and rescue volunteers. Nothing glamorous, but it gave him peace. "You?" he asked finally. She hesitated, still serving, different kind of battlefield. He nodded knowingly. "Leadership." She smiled faintly, "Something like that." Vale chuckled softly. "Figures. You always did like teaching the hard way." She smirked. "Only way that sticks." Then his tone shifted, quiet, thoughtful. "You ever wonder why we made it?" Claire's eyes softened. "Every day." He nodded slowly. "Me too, but maybe that's the point. We made it so the others didn't have to carry it." The words lingered between them, simple and true. When she finally stood to leave, Vale grasped her wrist gently. "You did right by them, Claire. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Her voice broke just a little. "I try not to." Back at Fort Liberty that night, she sat alone in her office long after lights out. The base was silent. The world felt smaller somehow, not in a bad way, but in a way that made everything matter more. The email from command still sat in her inbox, unanswered beyond her blunt reply. But now, she didn't care what they thought. She knew what leadership meant. It wasn't approval, it wasn't reputation. It was the quiet promise you made to the ones who couldn't speak anymore. Her gaze drifted to the silver star on her desk. For years, it had felt like a reminder of what she lost. Tonight, it felt like something else, a reminder of what still lived. She whispered softly into the dark, as if Vale and all the others could hear her. "I didn't forget you, I never will." Her voice cracked, but her eyes stayed steady. Because strength wasn't the absence of pain, it was the decision to keep walking with it. And as the rain finally stopped, the base fell silent again, leaving her with one thought that refused to fade. Sometimes survival isn't luck. It's responsibility. And responsibility never ends. When did defending yourself start to feel harder than surviving? The summons came at dawn, a soft knock on her office door, followed by a young aide's voice. "Sergeant Major Donovan, command requests your presence at 900, inquiry board." No surprise in her face, just a slow nod. "Copy that." She closed the door gently, stood there for a long moment, and stared at the neat stack of reports on her desk. Training evaluations, field performance logs, real results, tangible progress. And still, somehow, it wasn't enough. She reached for her cap, squared it under her arm, and whispered under her breath, "Here we go again." The boardroom was colder than she expected. 3 officers sat behind a long oak table, faces unreadable, papers spread neatly before them. Colonel Reeves sat at the far right, silent, distant, unreadable. In the center was Brigadier General Torrance, a man known more for politics than battlefields. The third, a civilian advisor, watched her with detached curiosity. Clare entered, saluted sharply. "Sergeant Major Donovan, you are aware of the nature of this inquiry?" Torrance asked, his tone neutral. "Yes, sir." He nodded, scanning his notes. "You've been accused of maintaining an excessively harsh training environment, fostering what some have described as psychological stress conditions among your candidates. Additionally, there are claims that your instruction undermines morale." Clare stood still, eyes forward. "With respect, sir, combat isn't a morale exercise." The general's brow twitched slightly. "We understand your perspective. However, the Army also has to maintain standards of conduct. We train leaders, not ghosts." Her gaze flicked to Reeves briefly. He didn't meet her eyes. Torrance continued, "Tell me, Sergeant Major, what exactly do you teach them?" Clare's voice was calm, deliberate. "I teach them what it costs to lead." "And what does it cost, in your view?" She looked him dead in the eye. "Everything, if you're doing it right." A pause followed. The civilian advisor leaned forward. "Could you elaborate?" Clare exhaled slowly. "Out there in the field, leadership isn't about orders. It's about sacrifice, about making peace with decisions that haunt you for the rest of your life. My trainees need to feel that weight before they ever hold command. Otherwise, men die because someone wanted to be liked." Silence. Torrance scribbled a note. "You realize this approach might not align with contemporary leadership philosophy." Clare gave a faint, dry smile. "Contemporary philosophy doesn't bleed, sir." The advisor frowned. "That's a rather grim outlook." "It's reality," she said quietly. "I didn't invent it, I just refuse to lie about it." The room grew still again. Even Reeves glanced up, something flickering behind his composed exterior. Torrance finally said, "Very well, we'll deliberate." Clare nodded once, turned and walked out, her boots striking the polished floor with soft, echoing resolve. Outside, the air felt heavier. The sky was gray, threatening rain again. She found herself walking toward the far side of the base, past the hangars, past the obstacle fields to where the memorial wall stood. Names carved into cold stone, hundreds of them. Her eyes traced the familiar ones, her unit, her friends, the people whose faces she still saw in dreams. And she whispered softly, "If they're judging me for being hard, then they've never seen what easy costs." That evening her phone buzzed, unknown number. She answered, "Donovan." "Still sound like you're calling in from a battlefield," came a rough, amused voice on the other end. She froze. "Vale." "Yeah, heard about your hearing." She leaned against her desk, tension bleeding into a sigh. "News travels fast." "Word gets around, you okay?" "I've been through worse." "I know you have," he said quietly. "Doesn't mean you should have to again." There was a pause, the kind that always came when people who'd seen too much tried to say the right thing. Finally, Vale spoke again. "You remember that last night in Helmand, when we were pinned down?" "How could I forget?" "You told me something before the comms cut out." Claire frowned. "I don't remember." "You said, if anyone makes it out, don't let them forget what it took." Her throat tightened. "Did I?" "Yeah," Vale said softly. "And now you're doing exactly that. You're reminding them. Problem is, the people you're reminding never had to pay the price." The words hit harder than she expected. "Maybe I'm just tired of carrying it," she said. "Then set it down," he said gently. "You don't owe the war anything anymore." She closed her eyes, the silence between them heavy with memory. "I'm not sure I know how." Vale chuckled softly. "You will. Just don't lose yourself trying to save people who won't bleed for you." The next morning, she returned to the training yard. The board hadn't yet given their verdict, but she knew it was coming. Her trainees stood in formation, waiting. She walked up quietly, hands behind her back. "Morning, Sergeant Major," Captain Voss called out. "Morning," she replied, at ease. They relaxed, watching her expectantly. "I won't be here long," she said finally. "Command's reviewing my methods, might decide I'm not fit for this post." A ripple of protest moved through the group, but she held up a hand. "I don't want speeches," she said firmly. "Just remember this, leadership isn't about how loud you speak. It's about how steady you stay when no one's listening. If you learn that, nothing else I taught you will matter. You'll already know more than most." She started to walk away, but Voss called out, "Ma'am, what if they pull you out? What happens to us?" She turned back, eyes calm. "Then you lead yourselves, that's the point." 2 days later, she was called back. The verdict came fast, as these things always did. General Torrance cleared his throat. "Sergeant Major Donovan, the board acknowledges your record and service history. While your methods may not align with current doctrine, there is no evidence of misconduct. However," there it was, always a however, "Command recommends that you be reassigned to a mentorship advisory position, effective immediately." Reassignment, not dismissal but exile in uniform. She saluted. "Understood, sir." Reeves finally looked up, expression unreadable. "Permission to speak freely." Torrance nodded. Reeves turned toward Clare. "Sergeant Major Donovan has achieved measurable results in half the time of previous programs. Her methods may be blunt, but they work. If we keep softening the edges of this institution, we'll forget what holds it together." The room went quiet. Torrance's jaw tightened. "Colonel, this board has reached its decision." Reeves straightened. "Then you've made the wrong one." For the first time, Claire saw something like courage in him. Not arrogance, conviction. She met his eyes briefly, gave a subtle nod. A silent thank you. Then she turned and left. That night, she didn't go back to her quarters. Instead, she drove out past the perimeter road, where the lights faded and the sky opened wide. She parked by the edge of the field, stepped out and stood there under the stars. The air was cool, clean, endless. She thought about everything she'd fought for: the trainees, the board, the ghosts. For years, she'd believed the battlefield had taken everything from her. But standing there, she realized it had also given her something: clarity. She didn't serve for medals, for command, or for approval. She served for the truth that soldiers like her carried quietly through the years. The truth that leadership isn't authority, it's responsibility. And responsibility doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Vale. "Still standing, huh?" She smiled faintly and typed back, "Always." Then she looked out at the horizon, whispering into the night, "They can take the post, but not the purpose. Because purpose, once earned, never leaves you. And some wars aren't fought on the ground. They're fought in silence, against the weight of forgetting. How do you teach courage to people who have never been afraid?" The transfer came through faster than she expected. 2 days after the board's verdict, Sergeant Major Clare was on a transport heading north, reassigned to a small base outside Fairview, a training outpost for incoming recruits. No brass dinners here, no polished floors or politics, just mud, wind, and the distant echo of live fire drills. The official paperwork called it mentorship reassignment. Unofficially, it was exile, a way to keep her out of sight, too respected to dismiss, too uncompromising to keep close. But exile didn't bother her. She'd always done her best work in places people forgot existed. The first thing she noticed at Fairview was the sound. No constant hum of vehicles, no distant drone of aircraft, just the sharp, clear rhythm of boots on gravel and the whistle of cold wind cutting through the open field. The recruits were young, painfully young, barely 20 most of them, faces still too soft for the world they'd chosen. When she first walked onto the training field, conversation stopped. Every head turned toward the woman in full uniform, ribbons perfectly aligned, gaze sharp enough to cut glass. "Sergeant Major Donovan," she introduced herself. "You can call me ma'am or Sergeant Major. Either one's fine. I don't answer to hey." A nervous chuckle rippled through the ranks. Her expression didn't change. "This isn't about teaching you how to shoot straight or run fast. Other instructors will do that. I'm here to teach you something different, how to stand when it's easier to fall." The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was attention, the kind you only get when people recognize authenticity before they even understand it. Over the next few weeks, she began to learn their faces. Private Langley, quiet, quick-thinking, always taking notes. Corporal Dawson, strong but reckless, the kind of soldier who'd charge through a wall if you told him it might be an order. And then there was Private Keller. He was younger than the rest, still awkward in uniform, always overcompensating with confidence. His voice carried too loud during drills. His salutes were too crisp, too forced. And every time Claire looked at him, she saw someone else. Bennett, her lieutenant from Helmand, the one she dragged across 200 yards of open sand while bullets chewed the ground around them, the one who died with his hand still gripping hers. She tried not to see the resemblance, the same jawline, the same earnestness, the same naive belief that war was something noble. But she couldn't help it. And that terrified her more than anything. One afternoon, she stood by the range as the recruits fired practice rounds. The air was sharp, the smell of gunpowder thick. Keller's rifle jammed. He cursed it under his breath and smacked the receiver. "Stop," Claire barked, crossing the field in seconds. "What did I say about clearing malfunctions?" He froze. "Ma'am, I—" "Show me," she said. He fumbled, clearing the jam with trembling hands. She watched, expression unreadable. When he finished, she nodded, again slow. He did it again, this time steady. When he finished, she said softly, "You panic, you die. The rifle doesn't forgive mistakes. Neither does the battlefield." "Yes, ma'am," he said, eyes wide. She started to walk away, but he called after her, "Ma'am." She turned. He hesitated. You ever freeze out there? The question hit her harder than she expected. Her voice softened. Yeah, everyone does. The trick isn't to stop being afraid, it's to keep moving anyway. He nodded, something shifting behind his eyes, understanding maybe. And for a moment, she saw in him the same spark she'd seen in Bennett years ago. That scared her even more. Nights at Fairview were quiet, too quiet. The recruits slept in barracks nearby, laughter echoing faintly through the cold. Clare stayed in a small room at the edge of the base, the walls bare except for one photograph, her old unit, taken weeks before Helmand. She kept it in sight, not because it brought comfort, but because it reminded her what not to forget. That night her phone buzzed again. Vale. You settling in? She typed back slowly. It's different, quieter. That's good, he replied. You deserve quiet. She stared at the message for a while before typing again. Sometimes quiet's worse, gives ghosts room to talk. He didn't reply right away. When the response finally came, it read, Then talk back, don't let them do all the talking. She smiled faintly. He always had a way of cutting through her walls without trying. By the fourth week, the recruits began to change. Her methods, calm, deliberate, occasionally brutal in honesty, started to take root. They moved with more coordination, spoke with more purpose. Even their arguments sounded sharper, grounded in respect. But Clare knew training wasn't about skill. It was about revealing who they really were when things went wrong. So she designed an exercise, one she hadn't run since her active days. A nighttime navigation and rescue drill through rough terrain, with limited comms, simulated casualties, and shifting objectives. She watched from the command tent as the teams moved out under moonlight, radio chatter fading into static. Hours passed, the wind picked up. Somewhere out there, decisions were being made, small, crucial, defining. By 400, most teams had returned, except Keller. Her jaw tightened. Comms, she asked the operator. Nothing, ma'am. Last ping was 20 minutes ago, South Ridge. Without hesitation, she grabbed her gear. I'll find them. The terrain was uneven, muddy from rain. Her boots sank with every step. The flashlight beam cut through the dark in sharp, narrow streaks. She moved fast, methodical, scanning the ground for tracks. 10 minutes later, she heard it, faint voices ahead. Keller, she shouted. Here, ma'am. She found them crouched behind a rock formation, one recruit on the ground clutching his leg, Keller beside him, applying a tourniquet with trembling hands. What happened? She asked. Twisted his ankle in the ravine, ma'am. Tried to radio but signal dropped. Clare knelt, checked the injury, then looked at Keller. You did good. Stay calm next time. Fear's louder than any radio. He nodded, exhaling shakily. As they began to move back, he said softly, I didn't want to leave him behind. Clare glanced at him, something tightening in her chest. She saw Bennett again, his blood on her gloves, his weight across her shoulders, his last words lost in the chaos. Her voice came out softer than she intended. You made the right call. Keller looked at her curiously. Ma'am. Leaving someone behind isn't always a choice, but when you have one, you don't. He nodded slowly, not understanding the layers behind her words. Back at base, she logged the incident report and dismissed the teams. The recruits slept. The lights dimmed. But Clare didn't sleep. She sat outside under the floodlight, staring out across the empty field, memories clawing their way up from the dark. The sound of gunfire, the dust, the faces, Bennett's voice fading broken. You did good, Sergeant Major. Then silence. She clenched her hands until her knuckles went white. The cold wind bit at her face. A voice broke the quiet. You okay? Keller stood a few feet away, hands shoved awkwardly in his jacket pockets. You should be asleep, she said. Couldn't, thought I'd check on you. Her lips twitched faintly. Role reversal, huh? He shrugged. You looked, I don't know, sad. She didn't answer for a long time. Then she said quietly, sometimes leadership isn't about being strong. It's about pretending to be until the people under you learn how. He nodded, eyes thoughtful. You think it's worth it? She looked out over the horizon, the faint line of dawn just breaking. Every damn time, she said. They stood there in silence until the first light crept across the field, washing everything in gold. For the first time since Helmand, she didn't feel haunted, just human. Later that morning, as the recruits lined up for inspection, Claire stood before them, calm, composed, the faint trace of dawn still in her eyes. You did good last night, she told them. But remember this, courage doesn't mean not being afraid, it means moving forward anyway. They nodded, the words sinking deeper than they realized. And as she watched them march off toward the field, Claire felt something she hadn't felt in years, not pride, not relief, but peace in motion. Because she was finally learning what all her years in uniform had tried to teach her. You can't save everyone, but you can make sure they know how to save themselves. And sometimes that's enough. How many times can you walk away from war before it follows you home? The message came in the middle of the night. A knock on her door, too urgent to ignore. Sergeant Major Donovan, the young courier said, standing in the doorway, eyes uncertain. Command orders, immediate travel, classified briefing, Fort Liberty. Her stomach sank. Effective when? 0600, ma'am. Claire nodded, took the envelope, and closed the door behind her. For a moment she just stood there, fingers resting against the sealed flap, the faint hum of the base generator filling the silence. She didn't need to open it to know what it meant. When command calls at midnight, it's never about medals, it's about ghosts. By dawn she was on a helicopter headed south, the roar of rotors drowning out thought, the cold wind tearing through her collar. Across from her sat an officer she didn't recognize, sharp haircut, nervous hands, too new to understand what that envelope really meant. He tried small talk, heard you train some of the best out of Fairview. She nodded slightly. They trained themselves, I just gave them mirrors. He smiled awkwardly, not sure how to respond. The rest of the flight was silence. Fort Liberty hadn't changed, same stone facade, same flag snapping in the wind, but stepping back through the gates felt like walking into memory. The hallway still smelled faintly of brass polish and old secrets. When she entered the briefing room, 3 people were waiting. General Ellison, Colonel Reeves, and a younger officer she didn't know, probably intelligence. Ellison stood as she entered. Sergeant Major Donovan, it's good to see you. Sir, she acknowledged, saluting. Sit down, we've got a situation. The intelligence officer tapped the console, and the wall display flickered to life. A satellite map, grainy and gray. Yesterday, a humanitarian convoy was ambushed 20 kilometers outside Helmand province. Local militia claimed responsibility, but intelligence suggests otherwise. These tactics, they're coordinated, familiar. Claire's eyes narrowed. Ellison continued. We lost contact with 2 vehicles, among them a U.S. advisor team. She felt something cold settle in her chest. How many survivors? Unknown. He paused, studying her face. We want your insight, Donovan. You know that region better than anyone still breathing. Her jaw tightened. You want me to go back? Ellison didn't answer. He didn't have to. Reeves spoke instead, quietly. You won't be leading the op, just advising from forward command. We'll send a small retrieval unit, but they need someone who understands how that terrain thinks. She looked between them. Terrain doesn't think, Colonel, people do. Ellison gave a faint nod, which is why we need you. Silence stretched. She finally said, when do we leave? The flight to Kandahar was long, quiet, endless. As the C-17 cut through the night, Claire stared out the small window, the faint glow of the desert far below, the same one that had swallowed pieces of her soul years ago. She could still remember the smell of it, the metallic taste of dust, the way it clung to your skin like guilt. Reeves sat across from her, flipping through mission notes. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Claire didn't look up. "Doesn't matter if I'm sure, someone has to go." He studied her for a moment. "It's not your burden anymore, Donovan." She finally met his gaze. "That's the thing about burdens, Colonel. They don't care about orders." He didn't reply. When they landed, the air was hotter than memory, heavy with dust and diesel fumes. The forward base was small, barely fortified. Tents, satellite towers, tired faces. As she stepped off the transport, soldiers saluted, more out of respect for the legend than the rank. She ignored it, heading straight for the operations tent. Inside, the map table was covered with marked coordinates and blinking locators. The local commander, Major Cruz, briefed her quickly. "Convoy was last tracked here, Mountain Ridge to the east. No drone coverage since. We suspect insurgents retook old tunnels from Iron Dagger's days." Claire froze. Iron Dagger. Her operation, her ghosts. She ran a finger along the map, tracing a line only she recognized. "There's a ravine here, hidden route toward the wadi. If they dragged the hostages, that's where they'd go." Cruz frowned. "You sure that's not on any of our scans?" "It won't be," she said quietly. "We buried it after the ambush, collapsed the access road." He blinked. "You were part of that." She nodded once. "What's left of it?" Hours later, as the retrieval team prepped, she stood outside the tent, watching the horizon turn to amber. The same sun, the same dust, different lifetime. Reeves walked up beside her. "You don't have to go into the field," he said softly. "I know." "Then why do it?" She stared at the horizon. "Because I still can." The mission launched before dawn. Claire rode in the lead vehicle, her hands steady, eyes fixed on the terrain. Every rock, every ridge, every line of shadow was a memory. The radio crackled, approaching grid Alpha 7. She leaned forward. "Slow it down. This area looks quiet, but it never is." As if on cue, the world erupted. A flash, a shockwave. The vehicle behind them vanished in a roar of fire. "Contact, contact," voices shouted over comms. Claire hit the ground, rifle up, reflex more than thought. Bullets tore through the sand. Her team moved fast, taking cover behind a ridge. "Where's the convoy?" she yelled. "Signal faint, 200 meters north." She gritted her teeth. "We move." She hadn't meant to lead, but when chaos starts, people look for steady, and Claire was steady. The firefight dragged on for 20 minutes that felt like a lifetime. When it was over, the desert was silent again, only wind and smoke left. They found the missing vehicles burned, 2 survivors wounded but alive. And inside the second truck, a body bag. Claire stopped cold when she saw the dog tag hanging loosely around the zipper. Private Keller. Her recruit. Her student. Her heartbeat slowed. "He was with the advisors," Cruz said quietly. "Tried to hold them off, bought time." She didn't answer, couldn't. She knelt, fingers trembling as she picked up the tag. It was still warm. That night back at the forward base, she sat alone outside the tent, the stars impossibly bright, the air thick with silence. Reeves approached quietly, standing beside her for a long moment before speaking. "He saved them," he said softly. "Every one of them, held his ground the way you taught him." Claire stared at the tag in her hand. "He shouldn't have had to." Reeves didn't argue. He did what good soldiers do. She shook her head. "No, he did what good people do. There's a difference." Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "I sent him out there believing courage was enough." Reeves looked at her, eyes heavy. "It was." She turned toward him then, tired, broken, but fierce. It shouldn't have to be. The silence that followed said everything words couldn't. Hours later, as dawn began to rise again over Helmand, Claire stood on the ridge overlooking the valley. The same place she'd once bled. The same horizon where she'd thought the war ended. Now she realized it never had. It just changed shape. She reached into her pocket, pulled out Keller's tag, and pressed it into the dirt beside the faded remains of an old marker, one she'd placed years ago for Bennett. 2 generations, 2 wars, 1 lesson. You can train courage. You can teach leadership. But sacrifice always finds its own way. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the ridge, blurring the line between past and present. Claire whispered, "Rest easy, kid. You did what I couldn't. You believed it was still worth fighting for." And as the first light of morning cut through the haze, she finally understood. The war had never been about winning. It had been about remembering what it costs to be human when the world forgets. How do you come home from a place that never really lets you leave? The plane touched down just after dawn. Claire didn't move right away. She sat in her seat long after the engines powered down, staring at the faint line of sunrise through the window. The color reminded her of Helmand, that same dusty gold that made everything look softer than it was. When the cabin doors opened, the soldiers filed out quietly. No cheering crowd, no cameras, just the sound of boots on metal steps and the low murmur of the ground crew. She stepped out last. Her knees ached, her shoulders heavy, but she was standing, that was enough. Reeves was waiting near the hangar, paperwork in hand, expression subdued. "Welcome home, Sergeant Major." She nodded slightly. "Home," she repeated like she was testing the word. He hesitated. "Command wants a full debrief when you're ready." She gave a small nod. "Tomorrow." Reeves studied her face for a long moment. "He was one of yours," he said softly. Claire didn't ask who. She didn't need to. She just said, "They all are." Later that morning, she found herself back at Fort Liberty. The base was unchanged, the same echoing halls, the same scent of coffee and steel, but everything felt smaller now, like the world had folded in on itself. In her quarters, the silence pressed heavy against the walls. Her uniform hung on the chair. Her duffel lay half unpacked. On the desk, beside a faded photograph of her unit, sat 2 dog tags, Bennett's and Keller's, resting side by side. She stared at them for a long time. 2 soldiers from 2 different generations. 2 men who had followed orders, trusted her voice, and never came back. Her fingers brushed the metal, cold, heavy, honest. And in that stillness, she felt it, the slow unraveling of something she'd carried too long. Not grief. Not guilt. Just the truth. You can lead people through hell, but you can't always bring them back. That evening, General Ellison came to see her. No aides, no formality, just him in his old field jacket walking down the barracks corridor like any other soldier. When she opened the door, he gave a small nod. "May I come in?" "Of course, sir." He glanced around the room, sparse, orderly, alive with quiet discipline. His eyes landed on the dog tags. "He was one of yours, wasn't he?" She nodded. "Private Keller, good kid, too good." Ellison's expression softened. "We heard what he did, held the line, saved 4 lives." Claire's voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her. "He shouldn't have had to." The general sighed. "That's what every good leader says." She met his gaze. "Then maybe every good leader's a liar. We tell them it's going to be okay, even when we know it won't be." Ellison didn't argue. He just sat down, the weight of decades of command in his silence. After a moment, he said quietly, "Do you remember the day you served lunch here?" A faint smile tugged at her lips, hard to forget. He nodded. "You said something then about learning the most in the quietest rooms." "I did. Still believe it." Claire thought about it for a long moment. Yes, but I think I finally understand why. Ellison tilted his head. Why that? Because quiet rooms aren't empty, she said softly. They're full of echoes of the things we did and the people we couldn't save. You learn to live with those echoes or they swallow you. He nodded slowly. And you? She looked down at the tags again. I'm still learning. After he left, the room felt heavier, but not in a bad way. She walked outside as the sun began to set. The air was cool, the wind steady. The base lights flickered on one by one. She made her way to the memorial wall again, the same cold granite she'd stood before so many times. Her reflection stared back at her, older now, the lines deeper, the eyes harder. But behind that hardness there was something gentler too. She reached into her pocket and placed Keller's tag beside the others. "Welcome home, kid," she whispered. "You did good." The wind carried her words away, but she knew they'd land where they were meant to. That night she sat by the window of her quarters, the base quiet, the sky full of stars. Her phone buzzed. Vale. "Heard you're back, you okay?" She stared at the screen for a long time, then typed slowly. "Getting there." After a moment, his reply came. "You always do." She smiled faintly. "Not this time. I think I'm just learning to stop running." There was a pause before his last message. "Then maybe that's what coming home really is." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Days passed. She returned to Fairview briefly, not as an instructor, but as a guest. The recruits, now soldiers, stood taller, prouder. The field she once commanded echoed with laughter, not fear. As she watched from the sideline, Captain Voss approached, still in training fatigues. "Ma'am," he greeted, snapping to attention. "At ease," she said, smiling faintly. He nodded toward the trainees. "They still talk about you, you know, the ones who stayed, the way you taught, the way you saw through everyone." She chuckled softly. "That's just age, makes you notice what people try to hide." Voss shook his head. "No, ma'am, it's something else. You made us understand what the uniform actually means." She looked out at the young faces again, wide-eyed, determined, alive. "Then maybe I did something right," she said quietly. He hesitated, permission to ask something. "Go ahead. Do you ever stop thinking about the ones who didn't make it?" Her eyes softened. "No, you just learn to talk to them differently." He nodded slowly, understanding more than he wanted to. As he walked away, Claire whispered under her breath, "You keep them alive by living better." That night, as she prepared to leave Fairview, she stood by her jeep for a long while, watching the horizon fade into dusk. The air smelled like rain again, the same kind that used to fall on tents half a world away. She thought of Helmand, of Bennett, Vale, Keller, and all the names carved into the walls of memory. They weren't gone, not really. They lived in every lesson passed forward, every recruit who'd learned to think, to care, to lead. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't angry. She wasn't even sad. She was grateful. Because the war hadn't taken everything. It had given her something too, the clarity to understand what all of it meant. That courage isn't loud. Leadership isn't power. And heroism isn't the absence of fear. It's the quiet choice to keep showing up, even when no one's watching. As she drove off the base that night, headlights cutting through the dark, she felt the weight on her shoulders lift, not gone, but lighter. The road stretched ahead, empty, endless, full of promise. Her hand rested on the silver star pinned to her chest, the same metal that had once humiliated her, then saved her, then reminded her who she really was. Now it was just a symbol. Not of war, but of survival. She whispered softly into the hum of the engine, her voice steady, clear. "You don't fight forever, you just learn to live after." And as the lights of Fort Liberty disappeared behind her, the dawn broke over the horizon, pale, golden and quiet. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And in that silence, Sergeant Major Clare Donovan finally came home.